In this video lesson, as we learn more about industry coming of age, we'll explore big business and business moguls such as Carnegie and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan. Tycoons like Carnegie, the Steel King, John D. Rockefeller, the Oil Baron, and J. Pierpont Morgan, the banker's banker, exercised genius to circumvent competition. Carnegie dug ore from the earth in the Mesabi Range. Ships floated it across the Great Lakes, and Carnegie railroads delivered it to the blast furnaces in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Carnegie thus pioneered the creative entrepreneurial tactic of vertical integration, which means combining into one organization all phases of manufacturing from mining to market. His goal was to improve efficiency by making supplies more reliable, controlling the quality of the product at all stages of production, and eliminating middlemen fees. Less efficient was the technique of horizontal integration, which meant allying with competitors to monopolize a given market. Rockefeller was the master of this strategy, seen here in this picture. He perfected a device for controlling bothersome rivals. He called it the trust. Stockholders in various smaller oil companies assigned their stock to the board of directors of his Standard Oil Company, formed in 1870. It then consolidated and concerted the operations of the previously competing enterprises, so Standard Oil soon cornered virtually the entire world petroleum market as a result. The imperial J.P. Morgan devised still other schemes for eliminating wasteful competition. The depression of the 1890s drove into his welcoming arms many bleeding business people wounded by the cutthroat competition in America. His remedy was to consolidate rival enterprises and to ensure future harmony by placing officers of his own banking syndicate on their various boards of directors, and these became known as interlocking directorates. Steel ultimately held together the new steel civilization, from skyscrapers to coal scuttles, while providing it with food, shelter, and transportation, and building rails for the railroads. Steelmaking typified the dominance of heavy industry, concentrated on making capital goods, which was entirely different from consumer goods. In the age of Lincoln, considerable iron went into railroads and bridges, but steel was very expensive. When in the 1870s, Commodore Vanderbilt of the New York Central began to use steel rails, he was actually forced to import them from Great Britain because they cost too much to buy in the United States. Within 20 years, the United States had outdistanced all foreign competitors and was pouring out more than one-third of the world's supply of steel, more than Britain and Germany. What brought the transformation of the invention was the invention in the 1850s of a method of making cheap steel called the Bessemer process. It was named after a British inventor. An American had stumbled upon it a few years earlier. William Kelly, a Kentucky manufacturer of iron kettles, discovered that cold air blown on a red-hot iron caused the metal to become white-hot by igniting the carbon and eliminating impurities. He tried to apply this new air boiling technique to his own product, but businesses declined. Gradually, the Bessemer/Kelly process won acceptance and was able to create steel that was affordable. America was one of the few places in the world where one could find relatively close, abundant coal for fuel, rich iron ore for smelting, and other ingredients for making steel. So the nation also boasted an abundant labor supply, which was guided by the high order. Kingpin among steel masters was Andrew Carnegie. He was brought to America from Scotland in 1848, and he was climbing the ladder of success so fast that he was said to have scorched the rungs. He forged ahead by working hard, doing the extra chores, cheerfully assuming responsibility, and smoothly cultivating influential people into his business. After accumulating some capital, Carnegie entered the steel business in the Pittsburgh area. He succeeded by picking high-class associates and eliminating many middlemen. His remarkable organization was a partnership that involved at its maximum about 40 men. By 1900, he was producing one-fourth of the nation's Bessemer steel. The financial giant of the age, J. Pierpont Morgan, made a legendary reputation for himself and his Wall Street banking house by financing the reorganization of railroads, insurance companies, and banks. The force of circumstances brought Morgan and Carnegie into collision. By 1900, Carnegie, who was weary of turning steel into gold, was eager to sell his holdings, while Morgan had plunged heavily into the manufacture of steel pipe and tubing. Carnegie, cleverly threatening to invade the same business, was ready to ruin his rival if he did not receive his price. J.P. Morgan finally agreed to buy out Carnegie for over $400 million. Carnegie then dedicated his remaining years to giving away his money. Morgan moved rapidly to expand his new industrial empire. He took the Carnegie holdings and added others, watered down the stock liberally, and in 1901 launched the enlarged United States Steel Corporation. Capitalized at $1.4 billion, it was America's first billion-dollar corporation. The Industrial Revolution had come into its own. The sudden emergence of the oil industry was one of the most striking developments. Traces of oil found on streams had been collected, but not until 1859 did the first well in Pennsylvania, which was called Drake's Folly, pour out its liquid black gold. Almost overnight, an industry was born that was to take more wealth from the earth. Kerosene, which was derived from petroleum, was the first major product of the infant oil industry, and it produced a much brighter flame than whale oil. The kerosene lamp signaled the decline of the whaling industry, just as the new electrical industry rendered the kerosene obsolete, with Thomas Edison's invention. Oil might thus have remained a modest industry, but yet for another turn of the technological tide. The invention of the automobile by 1900, the gasoline-burning internal combustion engine had clearly bested its rivals, steam and electricity, for the car. John D. Rockefeller came to dominate the oil industry. He's seen here in this picture. He was a successful businessman at 19 years old, and one upward stride led to another, and in 1870 he organized the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, the nucleus of the great trust formed in 1882. Rockefeller flourished in an area of completely free enterprise. He pursued a policy of rule or ruin. By 1877, he controlled 95% of all the oil refineries in the country. Rockefeller showed little mercy in employing spies and extorting secret rebates from the railroads. He forced the lines to pay him rebates on the freight bills of his competitors. Rockefeller thought he was obeying a law of nature and reflected that the time was ripe for aggressive consolidation. But on the other side of the ledger, Rockefeller's oil monopoly did turn out a superior product at a relatively cheap price. He achieved important economies, both at home and abroad, by its large-scale methods of production and distribution. He efficiently used expensive machinery, and this called for business and consolidation, which proved more profitable than price wars. Other trusts blossomed along with the American beauty of oil. These included the Sugar Trust, the Tobacco Trust, the Leather Trust, and the Harvester Trust. The meat industry arose on the backs of the bawling western herds, and meat kings like Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour took their place among the new royalty. These untrustworthy trusts and the pirates who captained them were disturbingly new. They eclipsed an older American aristocracy of modestly successful merchants and professionals. An arrogant class of new rich was now elbowing aside the patricians. The ranks of the antitrust crusaders were frequently spearheaded by the best men, genteel gold family do-gooders who were not radicals, but conservatives who tried desperately to defend their own vanishing influence among society's best. Monarchs of yore invoked the divine right of kings, and America's industrial autocrats took a somewhat similar stance. Steel Baron Andrew Carnegie agreed that the wealthy, entrusted with society's riches, had to prove themselves morally responsible according to a gospel of wealth. But most defenders of wide-open capitalism relied on more heavily on the survival of the fittest theories of Charles Darwin. Captains of industry provided material progress. Self-justification by the wealthy inevitably involved contempt for the poor. Many of the rich had pulled themselves up, and hence they concluded that those who stayed poor must be lazy and lacking in enterprise. The plutocracy, like the earlier slaveocracy, took its stand firmly on the Constitution. The clause that gave Congress sole jurisdiction over interstate commerce was a godsend to the monopolists. Their lawyers used it time and time again to thwart control by state legislature. Giant trusts likewise sought refuge behind the 14th Amendment. The courts ingeniously interpreted a corporation to be a legal person and decreed that if such, it could not be deprived of its property by a state without due process of law. Great industrialists sought to incorporate in easy states like New Jersey, where the restrictions on big business were mild or did not exist at all. At long last, the masses of the people began to mobilize against monopoly. They first tried to control the trusts through state legislation, as they had earlier when they tried to curb the railroads. But they were forced to appeal to Congress after prolonged pulling and hauling. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was finally signed into law. This flatly forbade combinations in restraint of trade without any distinction between good trusts and bad trusts. Bigness, not badness, was the sin. The law proved ineffective, though, because of legal loopholes, and contrary to its original intent, it was used to curb labor unions or labor combinations, which actually restrained trade. Early prosecution of the trusts by the Justice Department under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was neither vigorous nor successful. More new trusts were forming in the 1890s. The iron grip of the monopolistic corporations was being threatened. A revolutionary new principle had been written into law. Private greed must be subordinated to public need. And we'll continue to discuss the impact of the robber barons and the trusts and the monopolies and their impact on the American industry as well as the American economy in our classroom discussions.